April 1945. The final act of the war in Europe unfolds. Berlin, once the heart of an empire, has become a labyrinth of fire and jagged stone. Among the millions of the Red Army is the weary sentinel, a veteran who has marched from the gates of Moscow to the Spree River, carrying the weight of 4 years of total war. The Soviet offensive is an unstoppable tide. 2 million men and thousands of tanks converge on the city center, tightening the noose around the crumbling Reich. For the infantrymen, the grand strategy of generals matters little. The war is won room by room, cellar by cellar, where death lurks in every shadow. May 1945. The Reich falls. In the ruins of Berlin, the silence that follows the final shot is the heaviest sound of all. The war is over. By late April 1945, the heart of the Third Reich had been reduced to a desolate wasteland of twisted steel and pulverized stone. For the soldiers of the Red Army, the grand strategy of empires dissolved into a desperate struggle for every shattered street corner and every cellar. Over 2 million Soviet troops and massive concentrations of artillery hammered the final defenses, turning the city into a cauldron of fire. The ultimate objective was finally in sight: the Reichstag. To the Soviet High Command, it was the symbolic heart of the fascist beast. On May the 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrendered. The fall of the city marked the definitive end of the Nazi regime and the conclusion of the war in Europe. By late April 1945, the Soviet army had completely encircled Berlin, focusing their fire on the Reichstag, the final symbol of German resistance. Inside the city, Soviet infantrymen faced a desperate defense from the remnants of the Wehrmacht and the Hitler Youth in brutal street-to-street combat. On the night of April 30th, the Soviet victory banner was raised atop the Reichstag, signaling the collapse of the Third Reich. For the survivors, the moment of victory was not one of joy, but of profound exhaustion and the realization of the scale of the carnage. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrendered unconditionally. The battle for the city was over, leaving a wasteland of ruins and millions of lives forever changed. By the final days of April 1945, the capital of the Third Reich had been reduced to a scorched labyrinth of stone and iron. The Soviet ring had tightened, turning every street into a front line. For the rank-and-file soldiers like those of the 150th Rifle Division, the victory was not a grand parade, but a grueling inch-by-inch struggle through the dust of a dying empire. The battle for the Reichstag was savage. It was the symbolic heart of the regime, and its capture was the ultimate prize for the advancing Soviet forces. As the smoke began to clear, the adrenaline of combat was replaced by a crushing weight of fatigue. The war in Europe was effectively over, but the cost was etched into the faces of the survivors. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrendered. The Reich had fallen, leaving behind a continent in ruins and a geopolitical landscape that would be divided for decades to come. April 1945. The heart of the Third Reich has become a landscape of ash and twisted iron as the Battle of Berlin reaches its tipping point. For the Red Army soldiers, the journey from Stalingrad to the capital of the Reich ends here. Every face carries the weight of 4 years of total war. Street by street, the Soviet advance is relentless. The German defense, comprised of remnants of the Wehrmacht and Volkssturm, is crumbling. The final hours of the conflict are surreal. Amidst the chaos, the individual soldier experiences a moment of profound, weary realization. The war is over. On May the 2nd, the Berlin garrison officially surrendered. The fall of the Reich was complete, marking the end of the war in Europe. By the end of April 1945, the heart of the Third Reich had been reduced to a smoldering wasteland. The city of Berlin was no longer a capital, but a graveyard of concrete and iron. For the Soviet infantrymen who had fought from the gates of Moscow, every meter of Berlin was paid for in blood. The fatigue was no longer physical, It was etched into their very souls. Street by street, house by house, the Red Army systematically dismantled the last remnants of German resistance. The symbols of the old regime were crushed beneath the weight of the advancing front. On May 2, 1945, the Berlin garrison finally surrendered. For the weary sentinel, the silence that followed the storm was almost louder than the cannons. The fall of the Reichstag marked the end of the war in Europe. A conflict that had consumed millions reached its definitive conclusion in the ruins of Berlin. By late April 1945, the Red Army had completely encircled Berlin, turning the once grand boulevards into a labyrinth of fire and jagged stone. Among the millions was the individual soldier, a weary sentinel who had marched from the gates of Moscow to the heart of the Third Reich. The final objective loomed ahead, the Reichstag. It was more than a building. It was the ultimate symbol of the regime they had come to dismantle. For men like him, the victory was seasoned with the bitterness of exhaustion and the memory of thousands of miles traversed in the shadow of death. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrendered. The war in Europe was effectively over, leaving behind a continent transformed and a city reduced to ashes. By late April 1945, Berlin had been transformed into a wasteland of brick and iron as the Red Army closed its encirclement. Among the millions of soldiers was the Soviet infantryman, a man whose youth had been consumed by 4 years of relentless total war. The final assault on the Reichstag became the symbolic climax of the European theater, a desperate struggle for every floor and every room. For many, the victory was not one of triumph, but of profound exhaustion. The cost of reaching Berlin had been paid in the lives of millions. On May 2, 1945, the Berlin garrison surrendered. The thousand-year Reich had fallen, leaving behind a continent in ruins and a world forever changed. By late April 1945, the heart of the Third Reich is under total siege. The Soviet Red Army has systematically encircled Berlin, turning the imperial capital into a labyrinth of fire and ruin. For the individual Soviet veteran, the victory is measured not in maps, but in miles of blood-soaked earth. Years of brutal warfare on the Eastern Front have culminated in these final, desperate blocks of Berlin. Street-to-street fighting is relentless. Every basement and subway tunnel becomes a fortress for the remnants of the German defense, forcing the Red Army to fight for every square meter of the city. Despite the imminent collapse of the Reich, the cost of the final assault remains staggering. Thousands fall in these closing hours, soldiers who survived the long retreat to Moscow only to perish on the doorstep of peace. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison finally surrenders. The fall of the city marks the symbolic and literal end of the Nazi regime in Europe, closing one of the darkest chapters in human history. By late April 1945, the heart of the Third Reich had become a skeletal landscape of twisted metal and pulverized stone. For the Soviet infantrymen who had marched from Stalingrad, the site of the devastated capital was the final destination of a long, bloody journey. Heavy artillery and tank fire systematically dismantled the last pockets of resistance as the Red Army tightened its grip on the city center. Yet, for many like the frontline veterans, victory was felt through a haze of exhaustion and the haunting memories of 4 years of total war. The fall of Berlin marked the definitive end of Hitler's regime, leaving behind a continent scarred by conflict and a city awaiting its new fate. By late April 1945, the Soviet army converged on the heart of the Third Reich, initiating the final bloody assault on the Reichstag building. For the individual soldiers, the victory was seasoned with unimaginable exhaustion, having fought their way from the gates of Moscow to the shattered streets of Berlin. On April 30th, the red banner was raised over the Parliament building, signaling the symbolic end of Nazi power in Europe. The cost of the Berlin operation was staggering. Over 80,000 Soviet lives were lost in the final 2 weeks of the war alone. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison officially surrendered. The Third Reich had fallen, leaving behind a transformed continent and a city reduced to total ruin. By late April 1945, the German capital had been transformed into a wasteland of concrete and steel as the Red Army closed the ring around the heart of the Reich. For the frontline soldiers, the fall of Berlin was not just a strategic victory, but the end of a grueling 4-year journey across thousands of miles of scorched earth. Over 2 million Soviet troops and 6,000 tanks were committed to the final assault, crushing the remaining pockets of German resistance in a relentless house-to-house struggle. Despite the imminent victory, the cost was staggering. The weariness in their eyes told the story of a generation aged by the horrors of the Eastern Front. On May the 2nd, the garrison of Berlin surrendered. The Reichstag had fallen, and with it, the vision of a 1,000-year Reich was buried under the rubble of its own capital. By late April 1945, the capital of the Third Reich had been transformed into a nightmarish landscape of fire and pulverized stone. For the frontline soldiers, the victory was measured in meters, moving from one scorched cellar to the next amidst sniper fire. The assault on the Reichstag was the final symbolic act of the war in Europe, a brutal struggle that lasted until the early hours of May 2nd. The cost of conquest was immense. For many who reached Berlin, the triumph was overshadowed by the sheer weight of 4 years of total war. As the guns fell silent, the fall of the Reich was complete, marking the end of the most destructive conflict in human history. By the final days of April 1945, Berlin had been transformed into a wasteland of ash and iron. The Soviet Red Army tightened its grip on the city, marking the inevitable collapse of the Third Reich. For the frontline soldiers, the weary sentinels of the Soviet advance, the victory was seasoned with the exhaustion of a 4-year struggle across the Eastern Front. On April 30th, the Soviet flag was raised above the Reichstag. It was a symbolic gesture that echoed across the world, signaling the end of the war in Europe was only hours away. As the fires of Berlin burned, the individual soldier stood as a witness to the end of an era. The cost of this conquest was written in the lines of fatigue on every face. On May the 2nd, the Berlin garrison officially surrendered. The city that was promised to stand for 1,000 years had fallen, leaving behind only the echoes of a devastating history. By April 1945, the Red Army had encircled Berlin, launching a final, crushing assault on the heart of the Third Reich. The city, once a symbol of imperial pride, was reduced to a landscape of twisted metal and pulverized stone. For the individual soldier, victory was not found in grand speeches, but in the grim survival of one street corner to the next. Street by street, the resistance crumbled. The German defense, composed of remnants and the Volkssturm, was overwhelmed by sheer Soviet industrial and military might. As the red flag rose over the ruins, the war in Europe neared its violent end, leaving a continent scarred and a world forever changed. April 30th, 1945. The final assault on the Reichstag begins as Soviet forces push into the very heart of the crumbling German defense. The city of Berlin, once the pride of the Third Reich, is transformed into a labyrinth of fire and jagged stone. Total collapse is now inevitable. At 22:40, the Soviet victory banner is raised over the Reichstag. For the soldiers who fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, the symbolic end has arrived. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrenders unconditionally. Over 100,000 German soldiers are led into a long and uncertain captivity. The guns fall silent. The Reich has fallen, leaving the survivors to face a world forever changed by the cost of total war. By late April 1945, Berlin had been transformed into an apocalyptic landscape. The center of the Third Reich was now the front line of the final collapse. For the Soviet soldier, the journey to Berlin had been a 1,000-mile trail of blood. Men like this veteran carried the physical and psychological scars of 4 years of total war. The Soviet offensive was relentless. Over 2 million soldiers and 6,000 tanks converged on the city, crushing the last remnants of organized resistance. As the fighting reached the Reichstag, the distinction between victory and survival blurred. For the infantry in the trenches of the city streets, the end was a matter of inches and seconds. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrendered. The raising of the Red Banner signaled the definitive end of Nazi Germany and the conclusion of the most destructive conflict in human history. May 1945. The heart of the Third Reich has finally stopped beating. For the Soviet soldiers who marched from the Volga to the Spree, the silence following the final surrender is both deafening and heavy with the weight of nearly 4 years of unprecedented carnage.